Melissa Goodman, and I am very excited to be here for this important conversation. I'm also personally very excited because this is actually my very first act as the incoming new executive director at UCLA Law's Center for Reproductive Health Law and Policy. Technically, I'm not active here yet, so thank you. I started in August right now, and actually I have to do this for my old job purposes. Right now, I'm still the advocacy and legal director at the ACLU of Southern California. I am here not with my ACLU hat on, with my future UCLA hat on, so I just want to clarify that. But I'm really very, very excited. And just since y'all don't know much about me, I'll just let you know that at the ACLU of Southern California, I lead and manage a team of about 60 advocates who are working to expand rights and transform oppressive systems in California. And that's what I've been doing for the last 5 years. Before that, I did reproductive justice, LGBTQ, and gender equity litigation and policy advocacy campaigns with the ACLU in lots of different capacities, mostly in California, New York, and nationwide. And topically, some of the things I've worked on worked a lot on expanding access to abortion and contraception, which obviously relates to our discussion today. But I've also worked a lot in wider areas, such as expanding sex education, getting paid family and sick leave for working parents, stopping government policies that enshrine gender stereotypes and gender discrimination, done a lot of sort of criminalization work, stopping family policing, decriminalizing sex work and HIV status. Because I come from the ACLU, probably not surprising. I've done some work on digital privacy, lots of privacy work at the ACLU, expanding access to fertility treatments, and a big bucket of work that I've worked on over the last couple decades is advocating for people deprived of reproductive care and birthing supports in incarceration settings. So we're not going to talk about all that today, but I wanted you to know a little bit about my background. And I'm just really excited to have this conversation. And we're here today to talk about abortion access and learn from very incredible experts that we are lucky to have here. And we're going to be talking at first about what new studies out there are telling us about the real world impact of the Supreme Court overturning Roe. And it is true that what we'll talk about today, there's a lot of bad news. There's a lot of terrible things that are happening to pregnant people out there in the world. And there also is a lot of ways that the flaws in our democracy and the sort of minority capture that is happening, that's being used to sort of overwhelm and suppress popular democratic opinion on abortion is happening. But so we're acknowledging all that. But what we really hope to lift up for you today, and I hope what you really take away from this conversation, is that there are also incredible things that are happening, and they're happening because people are banding together to innovate and to create new pathways for care. They're banding together to protect people's health and dignity and decision-making. And we're banding together to resist and really fight, slide into abortion bans, but also importantly, not just be reactive, but still fight for the future that we want and something that improves the status quo. So ultimately, I'll just say this and then I will go into the conversation. I believe firmly that ultimately we will win on this issue, and we will win because public opinion and people power is truly on our side, and we cannot forget that. And we cannot afford to get despondent, to get hopeless, or to get complacent right now, and we will win. So we won't just win to get abortion access back for everyone, but to create the world we actually want to live in. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll hear some conversation that will inspire you to even more action. So that's what we're going to do here. I'm going to briefly introduce my lovely panelists and get right into it. So first we have Ushma Upadhyay, who's a public health social scientist at UCSF and core faculty of Advancing New Standards in Reproductive Health, ANSWER. Thank you for being with us. We also have Liza Fuentes, who is the Director of Health Equity Research at the Boston Medical Center. And before that was a senior researcher at the Guttmacher Institute. We have Rachel Riboucher, who is the Dean of Temple University Beasley School of Law, and a professor and expert in abortion law, who's particularly expert in issues related to medication, abortion, and access. And then finally, Amanda Allen, who is a senior counsel and director at the Lawyering Project. And Amanda oversees the organization's Access and Innovation Program, which focuses on expanding access to medication abortion through telehealth and other innovative technologies. So thank you all for being here. And we're going to kick it off first, hearing from Ushma about an important new study that she and others have been working on.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you so much for having me here to join this talk. I'm Ushma Upadhyay. I'm a public health social scientist based at UCSF Answer and at the Advancing New Standards in Reproductive Health Answer. So before I kick into WeCount, I just want to share some background data on rates of abortion. Before the Dobbs decision, abortion rates were actually on the increase. It's something that is rarely discussed, but there were nearly 1 million abortions per year in 2020. We know this thanks to the Guttmacher Institute. Between 2017 and 2020, abortions increased. And our preliminary data from WeCount, which I'll show you in a moment, shows that increasing trend in abortion rates continued to 2022. Sorry, this is the slide I meant to show. So you can see that little uptick there at the end. But even before Dobbs, there were large swaths of the country where there were no abortion providers. You can see the middle path, the middle section there, where people were already having to travel 4 to 8 hours to get an abortion provider. Before Dobbs, there were 750 publicly advertising abortion clinics. And that's why you'll often hear people say we were already living in a post-Dobbs world, or Roe was the floor. Okay, so this is what access looks like now. So abortion access declined even further after Dobbs, and the darkest red areas in this map show where people have to travel over 8 hours. This is parts of southern Texas and much of Louisiana to reach the closest abortion provider. So WeCount is a project sponsored by the Society of Family Planning, and I'm a co-chair of the steering committee. So the purpose of WeCount is to gather and rapidly share data on shifts in abortion volume by state following the SCOTUS-Dobbs decision. We contacted over 750 clinics, abortion providers, to ask for the monthly number of abortions provided for any reason, any gestation. So we received data from about 80% of clinics. And I want to be clear now that we did not receive data or ask for or receive data on self-managed abortions. So the data I'm going to be presenting are abortions provided by abortion facilities or telehealth, so within the healthcare system. So we took several steps to account for those missing clinics. We imputed data, both at the clinic month level for clinics that were missing individual months, and then state level data for clinics that did not participate at all. So these steps allowed us to estimate the total number of abortions provided. So here's the overall findings. We have data from April through December of last year. In April, there were 82,000 abortions provided. You can see a bump up in June here. Bump up in June, right before the Dobbs ruling. So you can see the providers were trying to get patients in. And then a rapid decline in the months following Dobbs. There was a slight increase in December, and that is we stopped our process. We tried to investigate what was happening, and it turns out that this is natural seasonality of in abortion care, as well as there was a shift. Some very large clinics were shifting their EMR, medical records electronic medical record systems. So about a week of patients were pushed into December. So this is kind of natural fluctuations that we're seeing here in the November and December together. But in the first 6 months after Dobbs, there were about 32,000 fewer abortions than expected. So assuming this trend continues, we are expecting to see 60,000 fewer abortions per year after the Dobbs decision. When I say 60,000 fewer abortions, I'm talking about 60,000 people's lives who were upended by the Dobbs decision, people whose life trajectories were altered tremendously. We also saw striking increases in telehealth abortions. So and these are just abortions provided by virtual clinics. We were not able to separate telehealth abortions provided by brick and mortar clinics. But just looking at the virtual clinics, the proportion of all abortions were about 4% of all abortions in April, and this increased to about 11% of all US abortions by December of 2022. And we are expecting that this increase this will continue. This trend will continue. Just looking at some state level findings, here you can see the darkest purple states saw the largest reductions, and the dark green states are the states that saw the largest increases. So you can see, first of all, there's lots of dark purple, but not the same number of dark green states. So that says one thing. Clearly, the protected access states did not fill the surge. And then also most of the darker green states are in the middle of the country. Not California is not very green at all. New York is also same color. So the states that have all of these resources did not see huge increases of patients. This is a graphic that was produced by the New York Times. It was beautiful. And I should say that the previous one was developed by 538. But the New York Times developed this one and shows the states with the largest drops in numbers of abortions, which we expected. Texas, Georgia is interesting because Georgia has a 6-week ban. And so abortion is still available, but they still saw massive reductions compared to April. Tennessee, Arizona, and Ohio. Ohio also has abortions still available, but just also huge reductions in numbers of abortions. And then the largest increases were in Illinois, Florida, and North Carolina. Florida and North Carolina are two states where legislation is being considered to implement gestational limits. So that would be devastating for many states throughout the South. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much, and we can lead into our discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Ushma. That was important information. I guess I'll kick us off this way. You know, the data that Ushma just shared obviously shows that there's a large number of people who, I'll give you some time to get over here like that. That was good. Obviously, this is showing that there is a large number of people who are either no longer obtaining abortions, either at all, or in the places or ways that people used to obtain the care. So we know there are some people who are forced to carry pregnancies. And we know others are finding sort of alternative methods and ways to obtain care, and that there's sort of strong movement out there and creativity to still reach people in various different ways. So a couple things I want to hit on here for folks. And Liza, I might go to you first on this. You know, what impact do you think people now having to sort of navigate new barriers or get care in different kind of ways or in harder ways, than they used to? What is that really meaning kind of for a pregnant person these days? And what does that look like? And what should we make of it?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. So I want to start with something that Ushma said, which is when we talk about, 62,000 people in an entire year not getting an abortion they would have had. First and foremost, we are talking about people who are continuing pregnancies that they had already decided were pregnancies that they could not continue. So, that's the harm that I think that many people who are concerned about this issue, their mind goes to first. So the first thing we think about is, who are the people who ended up continuing their pregnancies, right? Our collective research over the past several decades before Dobbs has led us to understand that these are the people who had the least resources to obtain abortion in the first place, right? So they may be people who, even if they had had an abortion before Dobbs, they may have come to them at great cost anyway, right? Out of pocket costs, travel, making arrangements, potentially disclosing their need to abortion to people they didn't want to or didn't anticipate. That now they've been forced to carry to term, or to continue their pregnancy. And I want to talk about the people who were subject to the abortion bans and restrictions after Dobbs, who still did get their abortion. It's about, I just quickly did the numbers. So to put even further into context what it means when we say about 62,000 people in a year wouldn't have gotten abortion. Many people may think, well, there's 1 million abortions a year in the United States. That's actually not as big of an impact that we would think that we would have. And I want to just step back and remind us that many people were not subject to abortion bans afterwards, right? So we would not necessarily expect numbers to change among the people who needed abortions who lived in states that didn't have bans. So this is really rough, but I just looked at the numbers. What are the number of abortions that were provided in the year 2020, so before Dobbs, and a year when abortion rates, we had evidence that they were going up in states that are now subject to bans, including Georgia with a 6-week ban. It was about 167,000 abortions. So if you're looking at 62,000 abortions divided by 167,000, something like 40 to 45% of people were subject to bans continue to pregnancy. No?
The drop is in formal sector abortion, so some of those people got informal.
That's where I'm going, right? So who didn't get an abortion that they would have gotten, the abortion that they would have chosen to get, right? So what happened to the other 50% of people? Some people did self-manage their abortion, probably a lot of people, and we have some evidence that has come out, from evaluations of online abortion providers like Aid Access. Some people continue to pregnancy. And those are really the only two choices. Some people may have continued a pregnancy and placed a baby for adoption. Previous research has showed us that is a vanishingly small number of people. The vast majority of people who need an abortion and who aren't able to get one, the research that we have now shows us that they're really choosing between abortion and parenting, not abortion and adoption. So that really speaks to some of the issues that were raised in the arguments in the Dobbs decision and the actual decision in Dobbs, which looked to adoption or giving up a baby as a workaround for abortion. And we know that does not reflect people's preferences, decisions, or wishes about what they want to do with their pregnancy. So just laying out those outcomes and the the proportion of people who were affected by abortion bans after Dobbs who truly did not get the abortion they wanted, it's like 40 to 50% of people. And then finally, I'll say, this is research that we are still doing after Dobbs, but previous research has showed us that the people who are able to make those choices is not distributed easily across socioeconomic status and race and age for certain. And so what's of great interest and what we suspect is that people who have the fewest amount of resources, right? Teenagers who don't necessarily have their own money, people who are already struggling to make ends meet, and certainly people who already experience discrimination, racism, and seeking reproductive health care generally are probably going to be represented in those groups of people who either continued their pregnancy or had other pathways to self-managed abortion that weren't quite as easy.
Thanks for that, Liza. Diving in a little bit more into what people are dealing with when they have to sort of navigate in new ways, both from the person who needs care and the provider. A question more, I guess, for Rachel and Amanda here, because it goes a little bit to the legal liabilities. we know that there's some innovations happening. There's some, people are getting medication abortion through particular ways. There is self-managed abortion that is happening. There's things related to telehealth, and there's a lot of good things happening for people to get the care that they need, but some of those things also come with legal risks to whoever's involved. And going to some of your points, Liza, like the risks will disproportionately fall on people who are already vulnerable and already marginalized. Can you both, and you can pick who goes first, speak a little bit about, the risks that pregnant people, providers, or other people in this moment are sort of facing, and the way people need to really balance and deal with that tension of needing to innovate, but also not wanting, to criminalize or put people at risk of prosecution.
You want to rock, paper, scissors for it? Yeah, go ahead. So a couple of sort of initial reactions. One is that when you're talking about risks to abortion providers, there's kind of a lot of emphasis on, people traveling and, can the laws of that state where the person is traveling from that's banned abortion, can they reach into that state? Can people who support travelers also be somehow held criminally liable? And so I think it's important to just sort of level set that currently there's no state that bans traveling for an abortion, and there's no state that bans helping someone travel for an abortion. And these activities are constitutionally protected. However, we know that our opposition is extremely hostile, and they don't really care what the law says. They don't really care what's constitutionally protected. And so the risks really come in when you're talking about law enforcement applying the law in ways that it shouldn't ever be applied. And for example, one example that comes to mind is Texas. A couple of members of the Texas legislature wrote a letter to Texas abortion funds and accused them of being criminal organizations for helping Texans leave the state to access care, sometimes, at hundreds or even 1,000 miles away. And so that's the kind of threat that providers and helpers, those are the kinds of threats that they're facing. And then the other piece I just wanted to flag, and then I'm sure Rachel has plenty to add, is you mentioned, sort of liability for patients, right? Like what are people who need abortion services looking at in terms of prosecution and other forms of legal liability? And to me, there's really two kind of primary ways that a person seeking an abortion, whether within the medical system or outside of the medical system, could get ensnared in the legal system. One, an abusive partner. We saw this most recently in Texas, where a man sued his ex-wife's friends for helping her access medication abortion pills. And this, now it's coming out that, this guy has a history of controlling and abusive behavior towards her. And so again, as Liza and others have said, like people who are most impacted by the restrictions and really that the hostility toward abortion are those who are already, facing the most barriers to accessing healthcare and safety. And then the second way is someone's own healthcare provider, right? So we have so many stories of patients who are, going home from, traveling to a state where they can legally access abortion and going to their home state and being nervous about their amount of bleeding, being worried about, am I still pregnant? And their healthcare provider reporting them. No state would require reporting a patient under those circumstances, but we see it happen all the time. And so there's sort of like, those are the most dangerous places to be, I think, for an abortion seeker right now. And I think it's just important to underscore that, especially for healthcare providers, we need to educate them on what's really required of them when they see a patient who they even just suspect had an abortion, right? Sometimes it's not even clear.
I guess I would just add, I would agree with what Amanda contributed, and just add that I think about the legal risks from what's occurring now to what may occur in the future, because I think that was a nice way to distinguish what we should be thinking about presently and then in months and maybe years to come. So picking up on the travel bans, there is the Texas Freedom Caucus that Amanda mentioned, but there's also, I think we're starting to see currently strategies that in effect chill travel. So you have the Idaho abortion trafficking law that applies to minors, and make no mistake, this is straight out of the Students for Life handbook. And that essentially will penalize people helping minors seek an abortion in the state. But of course, the effect of how the language is written is it could be applied to someone who is driving them back into Idaho. So the right to travel doesn't mean much if you can't leave, because as soon as you come back, you're subject to this law. So this is pretty ingenious in a sense, because it is written in a way to avoid the right to travel argument. And you're going to have to convince a court that the law runs afoul of the constitutional right to travel or interstate commerce protections or something else because of its effect that it has on chilling travel. So that's something we're seeing currently. And one of the responses to potential de facto or explicit bans on travel have been shield laws. So these are laws that have been enacted in 14 jurisdictions. They seek to protect providers who are providing legal care to people in their state that's legal under that state's law. An increasing number of these states not only include reproductive health services that include abortion, but they also include gender-affirming care. And so the idea is that the state of California is not going to extradite someone to Idaho for helping a minor. They're not going to contemplate subpoenas or depositions or other mechanisms by which someone could investigate and use legal apparatus of the state of California against that provider if the care was legal here. And an increasing number of states, in addition to protecting malpractice, protecting providers and people who help them from disciplinary measures from medical boards, insurance rates, have included language that seek to protect providers who are providing legal health care regardless of patient location, which might cover, and we'll get into this with the NIFI cases, the medication abortion cases in telehealth, might cover the provider who is mailing medication abortion out of state. So that's a response to some of these legal risks, but they have their own legal risks. They're called shield laws, but they are not a shield that covers one's whole self. Of course, California can't stop an Idaho court from doing anything. So if you live in Idaho, the fact that you did something legal in California and the Idaho law targets you, as soon as you step foot back in Idaho, you're subject to Idaho's law. And so these shield laws are an imperfect response because they can't stop a state from doing something within its own borders. And it only tries to shield people from activities that have to have the cooperation of the shielding states. We can talk about other risks, but that's a pretty big risk. People have licenses in multiple states. People travel. You better hope you never have a layover in Dallas, Texas. Those kinds of worries, I think, are part of the risk landscape. And then the last thing I'd say about not just what we might anticipate, but what's happening now, another legal risk to put on the table is how the confusing nature of the bans we have. They're badly written exceptions, they're badly worded statutes. It's created a lot of confusion. Even for a provider who is willing to interpret their ban in ways to provide care that's allowed by the ban, they've received very little guidance from their own states in many places, and the confusion prevails. So that itself is a legal risk when you don't know, and this has been subject to EMTALA, it's been subject to HIPAA, it's been subject to federal issues of preemption. Legal risk exists when you don't know if you are inside or outside of the law.
And that's by design, right?
Yeah,
That
right.
these laws were not written with clarity on purpose. Yeah, exactly, on purpose, because the chilling effect does its job. Absolutely.
One last thing in this topic of sort of like what we know and don't know about this moment, and then we're going to shift. And really, this is for anybody who has something to contribute. One thread of how people are getting care now, we've talked about obviously does involve more travel. Not for everyone, there's other ways, but what do we know about access right now, really since Dobbs, for folks where there is real restrictions on their ability to move, like incarcerated folks, undocumented immigrants who might not feel comfortable or be able to do that, people on probation and parole who actually literally have travel restrictions written into their agreements, or many other physical barriers. Do we know anything about what is happening for folks in abortion access in those kind of situations right now?
So, I mean, we don't know much right now. As researchers studying these things are incredibly difficult because you have to have access to people or people who know people. But the practical support networks that are really scaling up and bringing all of the skills that they've been building, frankly, since Roe versus Wade, to help people fund their abortion, travel for abortion, have intimate knowledge of many of these cases, maybe not all of them, if many of these people aren't even reaching those groups. But there's some things to keep in mind as we think about how those groups are being affected. One is that before Dobbs, people who were in prisons and jails did seek abortion care, for sure. At Guttmacher, the abortion provider census actually had a question on their last census about whether or not, like how many and from where people were seeing people who were in prisons and jails. And there were a number, I don't know the exact number right now because it's not published yet, but certainly people do seek that care. Something to keep in mind for those of you who are thinking about how the law applies and how that might play out as we think about it in the future is that people who are in federal prisons have a right to abortion care, actually. They have to pay for it themselves, but they are able to access it. So the question of whether or not somebody who is pregnant in a federal prison seeking care in a banned state is an open question that we're all really, really curious about. And then finally, in the case of people who are immigrants, when we say that, it's, you know, just to be super clear, we're talking about people who are not citizens, who are either out of status, right? So do not have documentation, or are not US citizens. Of course, we know when we think about misapplying the law, anyone who gives off the vibe of being an immigrant for racist reasons or other reasons can be subject to immigration enforcement harassment. And so just the prospect of traveling long distances for anybody who moves through the world with that identity can be quite scary, because getting pulled over can mean a whole different set of troubles for you, just by the nature of who you are perceived to be. If you are for certainly out of status in some way, shape, or form, being pulled over could really lead to your detention. And then we have people who live within 70 miles of US borders, where they literally have to pass through immigration enforcement checkpoints. This has long been a barrier to abortion care for people living in the southern United States. A place where research has shown, at least in southern Texas, there's always been more self-managed abortion for probably those reasons, and other access to medication abortion in Mexico. And so even practical support networks and abortion funds who are experts in making sure that people are as safe as possible as they navigate this care are there. Something to think about is that practical support networks and abortion funds, unfortunately, will never be able to fulfill the complete need of people needing care in this country. They've said so themselves, even though they are indispensable add-on to basically, which is an independent healthcare system, right? Accessing abortion. We have seen previously an appetite for looking at restricting abortion access at the intersection of, for example, of people arriving at the border, seeking asylum, or attempting to immigrate. So while I don't have any current updated data, I want to present that context for those of us who are thinking about legal and social science research to address those issues.
I'll add a couple more groups. Adolescents have no transportation. The idea of traveling, an hour, let alone 8 hours, just seems an impossible feat. And people who are living on low incomes having to take days off of work to make this trip, it really pushes it out of reach. They can't take the time off. They can't have the loss of wages. They need to find childcare since most people seeking abortion are already parents. And so the barriers are just tremendous and really push abortion care out of reach.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to Liza's point about how white supremacy really governs all of what we're talking about, right? It governs the existence of abortion bans and the attacks on abortion access that we're seeing. And one example is just how the attacks on immigrants, for example, really dovetail with abortion access. And one bill that comes to mind is one in Florida where a previous version of it would have banned not only transporting into the state of Florida a person that you know to be undocumented, but also within Florida. And so think about how that would affect the network of support that has been built in Florida to help patients get the care they need, not from other states, right? Florida, if you remember the map that Ushma showed, Florida is really the place to go in the Southeast. If you are in the Gulf, if you are in, that area of the South, Florida is going to be where people go. And now this bill could have criminalized, right, people just trying to help those who are travelers getting care that they need. So that intersection of the attacks against immigrants, the attacks against communities of color, and how we're trying to promote and protect abortion access, I think really can't be overstated.
Thank you for that. I'm gonna shift us a little bit. This is gonna be me asking any and all of you to kind of look to the future a little bit in a way that might be hard. But from the data you shared, Ushma, it seems like there's two important things that's kind of keeping access afloat a bit right now, right? There's medication abortion, and then there's clearly, as you were just pointing out in Florida, like states where clearly we know more people are traveling to certain states than others. You pointed out in your presentation that two of those, Florida and North Carolina, like have a lot of bad activity going on, and there's legislation passed that could make it much, much harder for people to access there. So looking ahead, what do you think the future likely holds for access if, either states where people are traveling to have more restrictive laws or bans. And also if we all know this medication abortion litigation is happening, what happens if we lose, or things like, the very broad theories that we could lose on get implemented. I know those are two very different questions, so you can decide for yourself which angle to take, but would love to hear what you think the future might hold.
Well, we can start with the doomsday scenario. So that for those who aren't familiar, the litigation in the Fifth Circuit, the panel that was just chosen this week, it stems from a case in which a federal district court in Amarillo lifted FDA approval of mifepristone, which is the first drug of medication abortion. And that approval was lifted approval from 23 years ago, and then also suspended under the APA the subsequent rule revisions that the FDA had implemented in 2016, 2019, and 2021, which include approving the generic version of mifepristone. The Fifth Circuit basically agreed with the district court, except for its determination that the FDA was outside of its regulatory authority when it granted approval to mifepristone in 2000. The Supreme Court has stayed that decision. So that's all to say that the last few weeks have been wild. There's been with the landmine of the Amarillo decision, and then the Fifth Circuit essentially implementing a regulatory regime that existed before 2016. Now with the Supreme Court stay, we all are waiting to see what this Fifth Circuit does. To be clear, nothing has changed at the moment. Mifepristone, the first drug, is still regulated in all the same ways it was regulated before the decision of this court. So Melissa's question, I think, is if the Fifth Circuit agrees in some way with the district court and the Supreme Court ends up agreeing as well, which is a possibility, what happens? Well, I think that's a very live question. Because I think a couple of things could happen. You would have, I think, the FDA tasked with deciding what the status of mifepristone is. It would be if this is what the Supreme Court decides, that approval was improperly granted and the court has the power to suspend it without reference to any congressional statute or process, then the FDA could reapprove mifepristone. That will depend on leadership at the FDA and the like. The FDA could use its enforcement discretion to say that like supplements or vitamins or other unapproved drugs, we're not going to target them because we believe that mifepristone is very safe, which it is. There's also strategies of off-label prescription in places where that's allowed, and a change in protocol for how medication abortion is delivered, switching from a 2-drug regimen to a 1-drug regimen. These are all on the table, but they all are pretty dramatic shifts in the landscape we've been operating in. The other issue to put on the table, is this too wonky? Is this too much in the weeds? Okay. I just caught myself in a real nerd moment.
We like it. We like your
Yeah,
company.
I'm trying to resist. But the other thing that could happen is that the Fifth Circuit and ultimately the Supreme Court could breathe life into an 1873 act called the Comstock Act, which is a federal law. We're seeing litigation bubble up around it. It bans anything that would help assist in abortion. And when I say anything, I mean anything. That's literally what the statute says, a drug, an instrument, thing that would help support an abortion. And if the court has already hinted at the district level and the Fifth Circuit that it finds persuasive that this law should still be in effect, even though it's been narrowed by previous Supreme Court decisions, even though it hasn't been enforced in 100 years, that it should be just read textually, so literally, and ban mailing medication abortion. If the Supreme Court agrees, we're also going to see some real changes, maybe just temporarily, but real changes in mailing medication abortion, which make no mistake, is the impetus for this litigation. The reason we are seeing these fights over medication abortion is the portability of mailed medication. And so that I think presents its own set of issues about how to work around that. And maybe I'll leave to others some of the networks and means, telehealth included, by which medication abortion has been.
Does anyone want to add on to that? Or go to the.
Depending on the audience, I don't know if it was worth stating that this idea that the problem was not the original approval, but like the updated label, just to give some context, that the updated label was based on evidence that for an effective regimen that reduced barriers to people because it required fewer visits and less medication, and is like the safer, right? And I'm thinking about your Ohio study when people were forced. You want to talk about that?
Sure, we did a study looking at, so Ohio passed a law requiring use of the FDA label, which is the outdated label we're talking about right now. And so that law was passed in 2011. And so we did a study looking at abortions provided for 1 year before the law, when providers were using evidence-based medicine, to 1 year, up to 1 year after the law, when providers were using this FDA protocol, the outdated protocol. And we found that after the law, patients were 3 times likely to require an additional intervention to complete the abortion. They had many more in-person, like office visits, many more treatments, and more emergency department visits after the law requiring them to use this outdated label. So it is really concerning if the Fifth Circuit does revert back. But the other thing is that telehealth, you saw in the slides, it really has increased dramatically. And our research shows that, you know, it increases privacy, the ease, it just facilitates abortion tremendously. And the other issue is time. So we talked about these surge states. Medication abortion is allowing states like Kansas to offer medication abortion or via telehealth to patients within the state while they're seeing these huge surges. There's a 2-week waiting list. They're having to triage patients who are calling in for an appointment. And telehealth is allowing them to be able to mail medications to patients who are within the state, who live in the state or can get to the state. And then they can provide in-person procedural abortions for those who are later in gestation, who are traveling long distances. So it does have a tremendously impactful role in the post-ops era.
And just to make more of an existential point, like why the emphasis on medication abortion? Because the anti-abortion movement is terrified of medication abortion. It puts a lot more control in the person's hands. It's more private. It doesn't force you to go through a gauntlet of protesters at a clinic. If you have, you know, your meds mailed to you, you don't have to leave your home at all. And that is like the lack of control over that process is what terrifies the opposition, and why I think, as Rachel put it, like this is why this suit was filed, right? This is where they're going.
And I, just one more piece of information, on the same day that the federal district court came down in Amarillo, federal court in Washington said, FDA, you better not change anything because the evidence is so solid that mifepristone is very safe. And if you decide that you were wrong in 2000 and that your approval needs to be lifted, you're going to be acting arbitrarily and capriciously, which you can't do. And so now we have, and I just mentioned that because the Amarillo decision is just, it's like a mirror image of evidence that's existed for decades and what the court says. And that I think should be, in this context and in others, really noteworthy for any number of reasons that courts can, it's not interesting that courts disagree, but it is really interesting that courts deciding the same issue have such radically different visions of the evidence and facts. And that says something to us about the nature of this litigation, but it also suggests something to us about the role of a federal court lifting a federal agency's approval of a drug 2 decades after. So that's
So much to go into. I do want to say, we have about 12 minutes left in our conversation, and we had hoped to leave room for like 1 or 2 questions, but I want to give us a little bit of time to end in one particular area, which hopefully is a more hopeful note. Thank you. So this is, you know, for each of you, what do you think success in our movement looks like right now? I mean, we obviously have certain short-term harm reduction successes we can have and we need, but also, you know, what is success sort of for the world we want to live in? And what's giving you hope these days? Maybe I'll just start here. I'll go down the row. Ushma.
I think success would be reproductive autonomy for all people, to be able to have children, for those who want children to have children when they want to, for those who don't want children to be able to feel free to get the abortion care they need and contraceptive care as well. So just in a world where people have all of the options.
Cosign. Yeah, but if you speak specifically to abortion, I think, yeah, like I have always held it the same bigger vision, which, you know, abortion, we say abortion is normal, abortion meaning that it is just a normal part of healthcare. If you want to be part of healthcare, normal part of self-care, if you want it to be, in a way that's fully integrated into the way that you take care of yourself. How do you take care of yourself? And that goes above and beyond what we had pre-Roe. That's, I guess, or pre-Dobbs, sorry, which is what I was saying, you know, abortion clinics are amazing and astounding, and they will be part of our history and social imaginary, but they exist because of efforts to restrict and confine abortion. There is no medical reason why you need an abortion clinic, right? You can just go to your primary care visit and no one would know any the wiser. And to me, that's an essential part of achieving what Ushma has laid out.
Yeah, I think in terms of what is inspiring me or giving me hope right now, it's really the culture change work that's happening. The abortion storytelling, the work to destigmatize abortion, again, to normalize it, to bring it into the mainstream. And I say that because, and I'm not supposed to say this as a lawyer, but the courts won't save us. Like that is abundantly clear after what happened in Dobbs and even, you know, the recent completely lawless decision out of Texas. That said, we still can't, as lawyers, as advocates, sort of crawl back into a defensive posture. And so I think it's also really important that we continue to fight in the courts to raise novel legal theories, right? Like there are free speech rights involved here. There's the right to travel. There's the right to religious freedom. And so continuing to push in the courts, knowing that ultimately we can't rely on them anymore. But I think, you know, we can't shy away from difficult battles. The other side didn't give up for 50 years, and it's going to require probably that amount of tenacious action from us.
I'd agree, and I'd say that what would be hopeful for me is in that culture change to have abortion become an issue of not just reproductive justice, but an issue of justice that is firmly rooted in an agenda of redistribution of resources and thinking about how abortion shines a spotlight on the considerable wealth inequalities in our country and how they cripple policy reform and being able to choose to have children or not have children or make major life decisions.
You got a lot of snaps on that one. Well, thank you to our incredible panelists. I'm going to pause and see if there's a question from the room, then I'll see if there's any, there's a number. And I'll do the best I can. You were first, so you get to go first.
Very quickly, there's two words I haven't heard here, which is fascism and women. And I think we have to understand what we're up against and why we're up against it. And while we're very familiar, but we actually have to confront that there is a Christian fascist assault that's been building for decades and is taken qualitatively to enslave women. I'm wearing a shirt. Or is female enslavement. And yes, there are all kinds of other people that need abortions and they should have them and their rights to be defended. But we have to name this. And the only hope we're going to have is not telling ourselves stories that abortion win elections, which they might, but elections aren't win the right to abortion. We are only going to deal with this by confronting the danger and getting in the streets and fighting coalitions for nationwide abortion on demand and without apology, relying yet on ourselves. And there's been a tremendous amount of defensiveness and refusal to confront what we're up against and refusal to name why. I'm a part of the movement for an actual revolution in this country. And I was part of working with Rise Up for Abortion Rights, which sounded the alarm almost a year ago, righteously, and came under attack for it. Right? But I want to raise that.
Appreciate that. Does anybody want to address anything about sort of proactive actions going on, or Liza?
Well, thanks for your comment. You've inspired me to raise an aspect of what you said, and also something that you said before, Amanda, which is that, you know, this is not my expertise, but the through line of the erosion of voting rights and other like basic democratic infrastructures and the elimination of abortion rights, I think is part of how we need to, people are organizing, reproductive justice and people on the ground are organizing. You know, and this is maybe something many of you have already thought about, but like, you know, the South is not inherently conservative necessarily politically. It's certainly not Texas. But if anyone's ever looked at the congressional districts over the past 20 years, they certainly figured out a way to make it be. And the will of the people is not being honored in these places.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Can I just check first? Is there any Zoom?
Just a couple, so if you want to take some.
Okay. That sounds good.
Should we take them all and then take the question and then take the Zoom and then?
I think that I'll take one more in the room and then a Zoom one, and then we might be out of time. We go there first.
A two-part. One is a reflection on who we are and the absence of and in the room. So that's not a failure of the panelists themselves. We are standing and very informative, but we have to ask how we're doing outreach, because certainly we all know we're being this is physical appearance, but we know from being online that we have many, many men who are staunchly promoting abortion care. In all classes, from the most average men to on-campus colleagues such as legal. So we have to ask what kind of outreach was done, and why do parental emails were not sent to students. There should be, if we don't have at least 20% of them, we're failing to get votes, we're failing to get donations. And the other is for question to the attorneys on the panel. The subject was brought up, incarcerated people, occasional care, and immigrants were also needing care. I'm going to stipulate, since I don't in a bubble, I hear stuff they face attorneys or some Democratic side who come out against you. So, and the arguments, maybe I'm an attorney, but you may face arguments that from abolitionists, attorneys who say we are disproportionately seeing people of color imprisoned, and they're under duress. They can't make right decisions for themselves. You're tricking people into having abortions that are disproportionately brown and black. The same argument for immigrants. They are fleeing and escaping for asylum, duress, and showing up in their nation. And attorneys, Democrats, they argue that you're tricking women or people cannot make decisions under duress. And these are people that are just,
I mean, I think what you're highlighting is the possibility of reproductive coercion. And I think everyone on this panel has sort of, as from a values perspective, said like the world we're trying to imagine is one without reproductive coercion, one where everyone has the resources and the information that they need to make those decisions. And so yeah, I think I would challenge the sort of idea that there is an inherent coercion in the communities you're talking about. And then to your point about men, I would actually push back on that. I don't know if it's our job as activists and as leaders to make sure that men show up. I think it's men's
job as the panelists.
Yeah, but
and looking out the posters and emails.
yeah, but I think they read their like. I don't know. I'm not on faculty here,
I'll just
but
say the announcement for this panel was on Twitter. Are men on Twitter?
Yeah,
yeah,
They are.
but
Yeah.
you need them to be successful.
and that was my second. Thank you, Diane. That was going to be my second point.
I'll just confirm, people who are in immigration detention in prison are coerced all of the time. Abortion is not unique. And any work that we do to advance access to abortion should not leave behind the rights or humanity of any single person. And so that is the case.
And we should notice that, if we should care across the board about coercion, we should care just as much that people are sterilized without their consent or knowledge. And that is endemic of systemic institutional coercion. And so I think your point is a very apt one to shine the spotlight, not on the abortion decision, but the ways in which environments are coercive by design, and make all choices very hard to think of as consensual.
Okay, I'm gonna, just to do a time check, we're at 5. So I want to ignore 5:02 and I want to be sensitive to everyone's time. So I think we'll be able to take 1, maybe max 2 more, depending. There's 1 more in the room and then we'll see if there's time for the chat. Hi, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Winnie. Thank you very much for sharing this knowledge and research. I think it's very inoculating. My question specifically around the attorneys and also the researchers. We're seeing this like abortion exceptionalism, especially in right now, about eliminating of medication abortion, also expanding reproductive medicine. So I'm seeing like what we're bringing up here is like states almost the concept of standing and like the preemption and this like crazy use of like the Consent Act and the FDA lawsuit. So I'm wondering, like, is there any threat to health access and also nothing if the Consent Act is being referenced or something that has been standing like for so many years? Is there something that we need to like do when it comes to these legal protections for these providers? Especially because I understand that what we talk about today is protecting providers and also protecting travel. But when we look at all the liabilities, they're mostly the weight is on the providers. So what legal protections and limitations are we going to see in the future in this very long
So I think the problem with Comstock is that if the Supreme Court decides that it's in force and it has a particular meaning, that is the law of the land. And that would preclude, it depends on how broad or narrow the interpretation is. But the thing that we know about medication abortion and providers are that they have, even the enforcement of Comstock is not going to shut down abortion pills. It's not going to shut down medication abortion. And there will just be a different way in which medication abortion is provided. And states that want to protect providers will have to grapple with that new legal landscape and practical implications to protect providers to the best extent that they can. But it's not going to change California's attitude that people in this state should be able to seek abortion, medication, or otherwise. It will change the nature of it, but then I think to your point, then it becomes also a political battle to repeal Comstock, which we should be talking about right now. And we should be strategizing for how to make that happen. So I think it's 2-pronged. And I think that it's, thank you, it's a complicated question.
Thank you. Looking at organizer, do we have time for 1 more or do I need to wrap? We're good. We could do 1 more. Okay, great. As long as people are still here, we'll keep going for a minute.
Yeah, so I have some questions from the Zoom. One is about kind of potential implications of, sorry, everyone good? Okay, potential implications of criminalization of pregnant people and how that could implicate other rights. So somebody asked, like, could states, now they've successfully banned abortion, do you foresee states trying to regulate pregnant people's behavior, where they go to work, what they eat, what kind of care they get, kind of other rights, other mobilities, just by nature of being pregnant?
Already happening. Absolutely already happening. I mean, the use of child endangerment laws and chemical, child endangerment, child abuse, all kinds of laws have been used against pregnant people for activities, conduct that they have done while pregnant. And so I think we'll see more of it. But this is absolutely something that that is part and parcel of of the reversal of Roe and the the end to the federal right to abortion.
I think we're going.
I just want, sorry,
Yeah.
like we're trying to
I like
send each
it.
other signals about timing, but I think one more would be.
Okay, it'd be okay. Okay, I'm just checking. I want to respect everybody's
No,
time.
I don't think we're communicating very well across the.
Fair enough. We got time for one more. That's where we're gonna land. Was there any more from the chat or?
There is one more on the chat, if there's not one in the room, which is, I think, probably similar answer, of it's already happening. Do we foresee similar efforts to restrict access to contraception?
Well, I think there's a political appetite. The question is, how far has it gotten, right? Is someone introduced the bill? I don't know. But are there, is there a profound wish of the movement of people who have gotten us to where we are to see contraception be categorized as abortifacients? Of course. They think IUDs are, they think emergency contraception is. This is a decades-long battle. So, I'm not a political expert, but certainly in terms of efforts to confuse and confound either the actual science about these, technologies, or making meaning of them that isn't there. The foundation for that has been laid for decades, right?
The Dobbs decision provided a roadmap to eliminate all the rights that we enjoy that are sort of part of that privacy right. So that includes contraception, that includes marrying the person you love, that includes, forming your family. Like it really just provided kind of that step-by-step instruction for the courts should they choose to follow it.
Well, it's just a little sampling of where we could go next in the world, but I really want to thank all of you for your time, for your insights, and for the work that you do every day and work so hard at. So thank you so much. And thank you for everyone who came out and who's watching on Zoom. Thanks for this conversation.